Welcome to the special meeting of the Representative Assembly. My name is John Jeffrey. I'm the president of the SMA. We've been having a few technical issues, but I think we're getting through them. I will start with the land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that we are gathering on Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, and 10 lands and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the traditional caretakers of this land, and we reaffirm our commitment to reconciliation, our shared stewardship of the land, and our relationship.
Thanks, Dr. Jeffrey. And I want to just double check because we are having some challenges with our audio. Brian Sharfstein, maybe you can give me a thumbs up if I'm coming through. I have two thumbs up. Thank you. Folks, welcome back. I'm Kishore Viswanathan, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this special meeting of the Representative Assembly. I hope that most people were able to be part of the first session. If not, I will welcome and reintroduce our special guest, a consultant for a governance review, Dr. Brian Sharfstein. And he's going to lead us through a governance report. Dr. Sharfstein.
Thank you, Kishore. And I understand the time and the date, and I'll begin with an apology. There is a massive amount of material that the special committee needs you to know. And we could do that. And again, I want to emphasize, I have been asked to present on their behalf. I'm not presenting what I think. I am presenting the consensus suggestions and considerations and recommendations of the special committee. And I say that because on some of their recommendations, there are literally been hours of debate and discussion. And they've come to a point where they've reached a consensus they can live with, but with many varying opinions expressed. Similarly for the board. And what I will try to do is to present to you the consensus, understanding that on some of those recommendations, you'll want to weigh in and have significant debate, if not tonight, at some point. Between now and May of 2023 for sure. So with that sort of caveat in mind, I will attempt to get you through this very quickly. I'm going to apologize. I could assume that all of the RA delegates have read 100% of what we sent to you and understand it completely. And that would be fantastic because we're almost finished our meeting tonight. Or I could assume you are incredibly busy folks and you actually haven't read any of it, in which case we'll be here a really long time. I'm going to take the middle ground and assume you're comfortable and familiar with the material, or you will become comfortable and familiar. And I'll emphasize at the end how important that is. And it came up in our last meeting in terms of communicating to the members. The folks left on this call are the key to engagement. Because if you don't understand the governance proposals, it's hard for us to transmit that to the regular members. So we're going to rely on you to help us do that. So thank you very much for your time. Next slide. So what we're going to try to do is have you, I'm going to go very quickly over what the governance committee would have reported to you in the spring had time allowed, which is their work to date. It included a little bit of unfinished business, which we'll also highlight. But more importantly, we'll ask you to consider and approve, just as the general meeting earlier did, an expanded mandate for the committee and a work plan. Fortunately, I'm hoping all of you, or the vast majority of you, heard and saw the discussion of the general membership and will therefore be fairly comfortable with that without a lot of time being taken. So I'm going to ask as well, I'm going to ask Bonnie to get ready for the whirlwind because we're going to go very quickly. Forget the background, we already covered it. There is a special committee. It has 5 members. I would only emphasize you elected them. They weren't handpicked, they weren't appointed, they aren't a cabal from somewhere that we didn't understand. They were in a very open and democratic process elected by the RA to do their job. One has been replaced, Dr. Hammond, as he had not continued as an RA delegate, and he has been replaced by Dr. Lenny Pillay. The mandate of the committee, and I'm going to spend a minute here because this to me is the critical piece. This committee has accepted the mandate you gave it as an RA and has added to that, and everything they do and all of the suggestions they make are intended to maximize the efficiency of the SMA, make it more effective. Efficiency because resources are scarce. Effective because, as I think Dr. Leding spoke, there is a question of, are we losing our effectiveness? And as they do that, to bear in mind, all of that must be done in a way that enhances the transparency, fairness, and accountability of the organization and its leaders, and includes emphasis on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And those are principles that hold for all of their work. The work plan, they've met every 2 weeks. They've been meeting up until the last RA. They did look very widely at other our legislation, as well as governance models and materials from other PTMAs, the CMA, a little bit of American stuff. So they've had a lot of information to digest as they made their decisions and recommendations. They adopted a 2-stage work plan. This is a little important. Stage 2 is what you, the RA, told them to do. You had a resolution that said, we're worried about the way we're doing business in certain formats, in particular our election process and perhaps some others. They said, let's start from the basics. Let's look first at the overall structure of the SMA and its governance processes and review those first to be sure they're okay. Because if those aren't okay, part 2 doesn't follow very easily. So they did stage 1 and stage 2 to follow. And they're going to report to you their findings. I am very happy to report the first bullet point here. After all of that deliberation, and I'll take the presenter's liberty to make a personal comment. This is a group with a broad perspective, and I think careful consideration of options. Their conclusion was the SMA has stood the test of time. The governance structure we have today is almost identical to the governance structure that existed 30, 40, and 50 years ago, with some modifications and some modernization, and it has proven a fairly solid governance structure. No major deficiencies. Processes, different question, we'll come to that. And I think that's important. And they use the analogy where we would like the SMA to go from good to great, not from poor to good or whatever else. But they did identify some areas they thought might improve, both structurally and, more important, by process. Next slide. And I'm going to ask Kishore and others, if anybody has any issue and wants to raise something as we're moving along, please feel free to raise your hand. Don't wait for me to do this massive brain dump without asking. You were provided in your RA package 4 important documents. The master document gave you the current situation, the recommendations, as well as the rationale. So I would encourage you, if you haven't, it hopefully gives you a fairly simple explanation of all of the considerations. They also look carefully at a potential future nominating and appointments committee, and there's some terms of reference, we'll come to that. They then looked, and this was stage 2, very carefully at how nominations are currently done and how elections are conducted, and they have some significant suggestions there. And finally, because they are putting some reliance on something called an attribute matrix, they assume that many of you would say, what the heck is that? So they have included a sample, and I would caution that that is not the matrix they intend to use. It would be, that's one of the unfinished pieces of work. So what are they recommending? First, the overall governance structure. And as I suggested, and this is a snapshot of it, there are no significant changes overall. To emphasize a couple of the important points to that, the SMA is relatively unique in its structure. The Representative Assembly is the all-powerful authoritative body, and hence references in comparison to annual meetings of for-profit or not-for-profit corporations don't have this. They have taken essentially a parliamentary model and superimposed it on a not-for-profit model. And the committee's perception is they've taken the best of both. So you have a process by which you have given the authority to an all-powerful body, the Representative Assembly. They must be elected, and they are elected carefully at home and must maintain the support of that electorate if they want to move to the next level, which is an elected board. So you have two filters to get to the board: support back home, and then the support of your peers within the RA who see you work. And the committee thought that has stood well the test of time. There are a couple of other committees that are specifically dealt with, we'll get to. And then there are the core components. In terms of the core, the RA is made up of reps from medical staff associations, which they are suggesting should be maintained as they were, with a proposed change to the rep by POP formula, and I'll come to that. That's the major constituent. There are also sections, and there is currently one rep from each section, and they are elected by the section. And again, the committee is recommending a slight modification to the rep by POP formula that we'll come to. The board thinks this idea of the sections is critical in the EDI framework. This is where marginalized and underrepresented groups can organize and can apply for section status. And so section status and representation is one of the avenues to acknowledge and allow marginalized or underrepresented groups to be represented. And the board is even considering, do we need criteria if there should be requests? For example, retired physicians might be an example. Foreign graduates or might be another one. So there are options through the section process, which the committee thought was very positive. The two other constituents, students and residents, I'm going to pass over quickly. Status quo for now, but engage the students and residents in conversations about, do they see this meeting their needs? So there will be further discussion over the course of the year. Currently, both students and residents were comfortable with the existing relationship. No one saw a burning platform or overwhelming need to change, but students and residents both welcomed continued dialogue over the next 6 months. That's the constituents of the RA. And of course, the RA itself is, as you see here, a representative body elected by and from the members with ultimate authority, and the proposal is keep that with some amendments to the rep by POP. I would also note that, and we'll come to that on the MSAs, there are some changes from the board sponsored bylaw changes. The board of directors, lots of discussion about that, lots of models out there. Your committee is suggesting no change. Small board, elected from among the RA with that double filter, and with the nominating committee, we'll come to that, how you get that broad perspective on the board was felt to be historically have worked well and should be preserved. Committees, there are two named committees, and there will be suggestions for both. It is suggested the nominating committee should continue to be a committee of the RA, but expanded and joint with the board, and we'll come to that. And as well, they're suggesting the Finance Committee have some amendments as well, continue to be specifically named as a significant committee, accountable to the RA, but also some change in representation to include both board and elected RA reps. And finally, standing committees. And the board didn't deal with those. It will now, of course, potentially be asked to deal with recommendations on Legislation and Policy Committee, but they didn't see the necessity for changing the option for the board to appoint, as it needs, committees, economics, rural practice, whatever, and that would continue as board-appointed committees. That is the sum of recommendations for the overall governance structure. At the risk of time, unless someone has a burning question, I'm going to just proceed headlong into the rest of the elements of their presentation, but accept that we can come back to any of these during the Q&A. So now the specific elements, because they did do a deep dive into each of them. First, the RA itself, the rep by medical staff associations, no change. No change to the 2-year term. The Chapter 7 amendments will now be coming to them in terms of the ones you saw for the AGM. Those will be coming back to you, and whichever ones the special committee think should continue would be coming back as a proposal as well. And finally, they're proposing a new formula for rep by POP. Next slide, and it's unreadable, so I'll highlight a couple things. This had intense discussion and debate. I would observe perhaps no simple consensus. There was lots of support for the current. The rationale here is when the rep by POP formula was developed till now, we have more than twice as many members. And so the formula may not be as representative and appropriate as it might have been when we had half the number of members when it was last revised. So what the committee is recommending is the option that would add a couple of tiers at the bottom, where it used to say if you're more than 500, you get 15 reps. It would now add a 500 to 6, a 6 to 7, 2 or 3 tiers, which would allow Saskatoon and Regina would have a few, 3 in the case of one and 5 in the case of the other reps, by virtue of a huge increase in their doctor population. The countervailing opinion was keep the status quo. After hours of discussion and debate and consideration, I would say, the committee is recommending that small increase, where it would see Saskatoon going from 15 to 18, Regina from 15 to 17, total number of delegates 76 to 81, recognizing each delegate to the RA from Saskatoon and Regina is now representing way more members, 44 in the case of Regina, 73 in the case of Saskatoon, than a rep from any of the other constituencies. The countervailing arguments were a lot of the section reps are from Saskatoon and Regina as well, and isn't 15 enough? At the end of the day, that was the suggestion.
Dr. Sharfstein,
yes,
you invited questions or comments as we go along. Dr. Pillay would like to comment. Can we unmute Dr. Pillay, please? Go ahead, Dr. Pillay.
Sorry, Brian, to interrupt you, and thank you, Dr. Viswanathan, for that. Dr. Sharfstein, excuse me, this has been a popular question, particularly from the local MSA here in Regina. I know this was discussed at our local meeting, and I'm wondering whether I can invite Dr. Parvez. I did see his name earlier on the schedule. I'm wondering whether you could invite comments from Dr. Parvez or anybody who feels the need to comment on this rep by POP formula. What kind of ideas do they have? Is this a good thing? Do they have different ideas on this? Because I think it's very important that we hear from our members about how we can do better with this. There is the consensus that there's too few members in the RA from such a large representative population. So I'd invite our local delegates to please comment and help us here so that we can make this a better process. Thank you.
Dr. Stridham. Can we unmute Dr. Stridham, please? Go ahead, Eamon.
Good evening. I just want to mention that this specific item was not only discussed at board level, but it's also discussed at the MSA levels by the presidents of the different medical staff associations. So this is not this is something that was broadly discussed. The feedback coming from the special committee to the board, and also shared with the presidents of the different MSAs, just for background.
Thank you, Dr. Stridham. Can we unmute Dr. Parvez, please? Dr. Parvez, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, this is an ongoing issue. I mean, this is for a decade. I am fighting for it. I don't know. This looks to me like a bargaining going on. Oh, 15 can be increased to 17, and 15 can be increased to 18. Dr. Sharfstein knows my feeling very well when I was VP and I was the board and all those things. I'm not in a bargaining position at this moment. I am looking for some sort of formula. We are dealing with 275,000 and population keeps on increasing. We are dealing with 700 and 800 members, and representation, very respectfully, only 15 we have it. So we discuss about all these things with the help of my board members and all those things, and we discussed in detail with my executives as well. I don't know how to rationalize this. And this 15 seats, correct me if I'm wrong, is there for 25 years. So I don't know, last time I was told was increased something around 2,000. And since 2000, now it is 2022 and it is unchanged. So yeah, we welcome 2 extra positions, but again, I'm very respectfully saying, we are not setting up some sort of precedent. We are not setting up some sort of formula. We are just begging and asking and getting a little bit extra. When we are looking at a very small centers and their representation is 50, 60, 70 members and getting quite a bit seat, 10 to everyone, I'm asking for 50 seats, at least 50 delegates for Regina and 50 delegates or 55 delegates for Saskatoon. I know it's impossible. I know it's not going to happen, but at least some sort of formula should be suggested. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Dr. Parvez. Dr. Jeffrey, can we please unmute Dr. Jeffrey? Go ahead.
Thank you.
I'm a specialist and I'm in a big city, and that's a group that I think is well represented. I don't think it's a matter of 15 or 17 or 18. I think there are voices from Saskatoon and Regina which are heard at the RA. I do feel that it's a concern for smaller centers and more rural areas. I don't want their voices to be overwhelmed. So my 2 cents, for what it's worth, I would prefer to, a small, maybe incremental increase, fine. But I want to make sure we continue to hear voices from across the province, not just Saskatoon and Regina. I want to hear everybody's voice.
Thank you. Dr. Letting, can we unmute Dr. Letting, please? Go ahead, Dr. Letting.
Thank you. Yes, I have a little bit to say about the increase in Saskatoon and Regina reps, because I think the reps you got are presenting your points of view quite adequately right now. I don't think you're really diminished or increased by adding a lot more memberships, except more majority. I think the important thing about the RA is to represent the different issues in different areas. And in rural areas, we have a tough time even getting members there, and getting good members there is a problem. I'd like to make sure that we do have a good voice to represent the rural population, because I think the important thing in a really good RA is to be statesman and to work for the common good of the province. This isn't really about rural versus city, but we do need the rural voice there to get that other voice there. And when I vote, I very often vote myself in favor of urban issues, just because I am not happy with the access that city patients have, with the system you have, and I do support you, and I hope we all do that. But the diminished voice and ability to vote on our own issues by diminishing our numbers is not necessarily that positive. I don't think that the city are gaining a lot by more members, except the ability to basically quash out our concerns and outvote us. And I don't want to see that happen. I don't know if I'm saying this very well, but I see a problem with this kind of issue. And I think, quite honestly, I don't see the committee members in front of me on the table, but I know we've got a lot of city population on that committee. And that was one of my concerns when I saw it being formed, is that we needed a little bit less, city population and a little more balance with the other centers. Because we all have our issues and we all need to be represented in the end.
Thanks, Dr. Letting. Can we unmute Dr. Geller, please? Dr. Geller, go ahead. There you go.
Yeah, so I'm not an RA delegate, so I suppose I need to ask permission to speak from, and I guess, but I don't know if there's a motion required or anything like that.
Oh, go ahead, please.
So I guess this is exactly the problem I'm talking about, right? So here we are, this is the RA. The RA, as Dr. Sharfstein eloquently pointed out, is the be all and end all of the SMA. It governs it. So now we have a special meeting of the RA, and I'm not a member of the RA, but we have a special meeting of the RA arguing about how to divide power and whether they should be giving power here, there, or anywhere. When in reality, the people who should be making this decision are the members. The members should be telling us how they want to be governed. Rep by pop is old school way to govern people. And perhaps there's other ways that might be a little bit more effective and might address many of the concerns that we've heard here already. And I think that what, in a perfect world, what would happen is the membership would be engaged in a series of options of how they might want to govern themselves, rather than the RA arguing about how much power it wants to divide out among itself.
Sure, if I might, I just want to make sure, though, it's clear. This would require a bylaw amendment, and it's the AGM that will do that. That's the members. This is simply discussion, and I would assume this is one of multiple discussions that should happen over the next year on what would be a reasonable rep by pop formula that everyone would be comfortable with. So I absolutely take the point. Members ought to care about this. But just to be sure that we're clear, if the RA passed a resolution today to adopt this, that still needs to end up with a bylaw amendment, because that's in bylaws, and that is the AGM.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sharfstein. Let me thank Dr. Pillai for her patience and invite her to make her comment. Can you unmute Dr. Pillai, please?
Okay, thank you. So, you know, to Dr. Parvez's point earlier, I mean, I think this is a pretty fair formula, and I agree with the previous speakers who have mentioned that they don't want to drown out rural voices and rural opinions by having excess representation in the cities. And I do think that's why we have an RA. I would actually suggest, as a follow-up to Dr. Parvez, that what we actually need is a stronger MSAs and stronger engagement on the MSA level, so that we are actually hearing all the opinions of our colleagues in our regional areas that we can then bring forward as the RA to the broader SMA.
Thank you. Dr. Strydom, I see your hand up. Just before we go to you, I want to ask Dr. Sharfstein. Dr. Sharfstein, you have, of course, a very good feel for the rest of your presentation, and I know you're grateful for the comments from the members. are you wanting to hear additional comments at the end, or do you want to continue on this particular item?
Perfect timing, because I was going to comment once this conversation stopped. This is an incredibly helpful conversation that just happened. But it's, of course, takes time. And we're on slide 25 of 63. So that is the challenge, is to get the RA comfortable with the recommendations, confident, but also an opportunity to observe. And so I guess what I'd have to say is there will need to be additional interaction with the RA, whether it's through survey, other meetings, could be other special meetings. There will be an RA in the fall. So this isn't finished, this is initial. And similarly, I've come to the first of a few potentially equally, one might say, controversial. So I was grateful that you let this go on to get a flavor for how we'll need to debate several of the others, and some initial commentary within reasonable time. And I think your question you've posed to me, I would say, is a question for the RA. How long do you want to be here? How long can you devote to feedback now? I would just observe that we would be not quite half done. What I would go through, I'd say we're about a third done. Let that perhaps weigh how much we want to debate or discuss individual points. But it's crystal clear this issue will need significant discussion before an amendment is voted on a year from now.
Thanks. With that in mind, Dr. Sharfstein, we'll give you back the floor. And keeping in mind your gracious invitation to ask people to weigh in as the issues come up, I wonder if we could let you finish your presentation, have people keep notes themselves, and then ask for their comments at the end. Does that seem okay?
Sure. And we could do it, I think, in about 3 different chunks. So I'll
Okay,
tell
the
you.
floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. So the next is, not surprisingly, the sections. The committee thinks this, the idea of sections, i.e. special interest groups, which historically were the specialties, but could be others, is a great idea. 2-year term unlimited, keep it the same. They are proposing, again, a modification in the rep by pop formula. On this issue, we have not consulted, I would say, widely with the sections themselves, as we have with the MSAs and the previous. The suggestion is there are a few very large sections with only 1 rep. And the observation made, for example, in family practice being by far the largest, that 1 family doctor is going to represent rural and urban and all of the mix of family doctors, and that is a great challenge. Similarly, you see anesthesia has 117. So the suggestion was to modify so it isn't 1 per section of more than 10 no matter what, but to allow for more than 1 when you're getting up into the hundreds of members and beyond. And the option that they are proposing is 2, which would see going from 25 section reps to 30, with an additional 1 from anesthesia, an additional 2 from 3 from family practice, an additional 1 from internal medicine, pediatrics, and psychiatry. Again, this is a proposal for obviously section consideration and RA discussion, whether you want to keep the status quo. And 3 options were discussed, and others could be as well. The students and residents I've referenced, status quo pending discussions with them. The next one, and this I'll flag in advance, is going to be widely debated. The committee considered the current AGM and its lack of decision-making authority, other than it approves and can modify bylaws. It can pass motions and make recommendations, but they're only recommendations. And it does receive financial statements, and we've had a discussion already, do they approve them or not? In the end, it doesn't matter because the financial statements can't be changed, so they receive them. All to say they have relatively little decision-making power other than bylaw amendments. And in the discussion then, the suggestion was, could we not replace what has been a very cursory AGMs tend to be very quick, poorly attended, other than RA delegates who happen to be there anyway, and may give the perception of power to the members, but doesn't give that because nobody attends. It's not convenient. And as in their current way, they've sort of evolved, relatively non-empowering. So the suggestion was eliminate the AGM, but maintain and enhance the ability for members to attend and participate in RA meetings, which is the parliament and the ultimate decision-making authority. And members ought to hear what their parliamentarians think and say and be able to contribute to that, as well as the idea of the members forum as a formal invitation for discussion. And there is still the option for special meetings, either at the call of the board and or a group of members as well. And so there is this proposal coming forward from the special committee to eliminate the AGM and enhance all of these other processes to encourage and increase member participation in a more meaningful way. I suspect there's lots of hands which might pop up on that, and we'll allow that soon. The board of directors, essentially no change. And there was a lot of discussion, both the membership, 8 members, 5 officers, a president, vice president, past president, honorary treasurer, and a chair, a student and a resident, and 1 CMA board rep. Elected, all of those elected from the RA, and of course, therefore, must be elected to the RA at home first, the double filter, which they felt was very appropriate. There were some questions about, do folks, when they're voting back home, recognize that? And therefore, there is a need, and we'll come to that in process discussion subsequently, there is a need for clarity in the election process. In addition, the suggestion is there is some suggested changes. One of those, next slide, one of those would be in the term of office. Currently, they're elected annually, all of the members. The suggestion is it's at minimum 2 years to get up to speed. So the term should be 2 years, and there should be a maximum, which there isn't now, which would be 3. I would note for RA delegates, there is no maximum, and the committee did discuss that and thought that's quite fair. If you continue to be elected from home, just as you would to our parliament, by the members in an open and transparent process, then an unlimited number of years on the RA as a delegate would be acceptable. But for the board of directors, they're proposing a 2-year term and 3 maximum terms, unless you move on to become the president, which then would allow for an extension. In terms of the actual, there was a lot of discussion. Many jurisdictions have, instead of a vice president, they elect a president-elect who then will become the president and essentially has 2 years. And a lot of discussion about the pros and cons. In the end, the special committee felt our current structure has worked well, generally results in orderly transition, but affords the opportunity or chance that you're elected to that position for a year, and if for some reason it didn't work out, that allows the opportunity to vote for someone different in the position. So they're suggesting you would keep those same executive members as currently, and all, including the president, would be elected by the RA from among RA delegates. That's the one other issue was discussed at length. Should the president be voted on by the general membership, separate from all of the other officers and members, or by the RA? The committee is comfortable to recommend maintaining the current process. Again, I assume a fair bit of thoughts and comments would be forthcoming about that. Finally, the committees. Finance committee, critical, keep it. And currently it's the treasurer and 2 or 4 ordinary members appointed by the board. Next slide. The suggestion is it's important enough it ought to be a joint committee of the RA and board, responsible to both, would continue to have the honorary treasurer and 2 members appointed by the board, but also 2 members elected by and from the RA to provide that linkage that accountability to the RA as well directly. And again, a 2-year term, maximum 3, and the board would appoint a chair from amongst the committee members. Their mandate, duties, accountabilities otherwise would remain the same. And finally, the nominating committee, lots of discussion, of course, and a whole next section now in their process. But there is a nominating committee currently that is 3 members elected by the RA with the chair and one other, plus a chair and one other member, both of whom would be ordinary members named by the board. So currently, that's the way it's done. And it has a mandate to prepare a slate of officers, director, speaker, deputy speaker, board reps, and nominating committee members. There also exists an appointments and awards committee, which facilitates and assists the board in making all of its appointments. It has 3 members appointed by the board and from the board, and a chair, who is the current past president. The nominating, or your special committee on governance, looked at that and processes across the country and is recommending amalgamating those 2 committees. And what they would be suggesting is you have a nominating and appointments committee, and that committee would have a mandate combining the 2 existing. That is a joint committee. It's a joint of the board and RA. 3 would be elected by and from the RA, and they would not be current board members. 2 would be ordinary members appointed by the board, and the past president would serve as the ex officio chair, non-voting. 2-year term and a maximum of 3 terms. This committee would then report to the board for committee appointments and recommend to the board for committee appointments, and it would report and recommend to the RA for all of the elected positions that the RA elects. What you had circulated to you, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail at all, was a full detailed draft terms of reference for this new committee, and I'd encourage you to look through that. I will, though, with 3 slides, just highlight a couple things. The role, this is a committee that needs a high level of knowledge, because I would argue it may be your most important committee. It's going to determine the people who are your leaders, and it's going to help the RA make those decisions. So it is a very important committee with a high level of functioning required. There's a list of detailed responsibilities, and I'm not going to go through them other than to say the committee is suggesting expanding the mandate a bit to helping identify leaders, encourage participation, interact with those members, encourage them to put forward their name to become volunteers and be elected, and that they would try to facilitate that process, as well as an open and transparent process to let any and all interested and willing members become involved and be elected. So and they would be responsible to develop and maintain an attribute matrix to guide their decisions that would be open, so everybody could see what are the criteria we use or suggest to be used to bring forward these nominations and to identify and recruit these leaders and promote them. And finally, that the membership would be, as suggested, 3 members elected by and from the RA, 2 appointed by the board, and the past president was chair, 2 years, a 3-year term. There are other details in the terms of reference. I'm going to stop there because the next section was your original mandate, which was look at how we do business in our nominations and election processes and help to make that better. And so, but before we go to that, I think this would be a good place to stop, because this is the full slate of considerations as far as the overall governance structure. And we might take a few comments or questions or concerns at this point if you thought that appropriate, Kishore.
Thanks, Brian. Dr. Letting has a comment. Can we unmute Dr. Letting, please? Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, just a couple things. In the sections, I noticed that there were committees, for example, like cardiac surgery, that could well end up with no members. And my thought was, well, if you got a section without a member, they have no voice. So that doesn't make any sense. So I think you have to have at least 1 member for sure. Just a comment. Second point is the AGM. I'm not, I mean, I've been through many years on the RA, and when we talk about eliminating the AGM, I'm really trying to figure out what are we gaining and what did we gain by having it, and what are we losing by cutting it out? I really don't understand that little meeting we've had. I thought it was part of some sort of corporate regulation that we had to do or have. And it appears like all of a sudden it's really kind of a maybe useless process. If we can just eliminate it, could someone help me a little bit to understand what the implications are?
Thanks, Dr. Letting. Dr. Shannon has a comment. Can we unmute Dr. Shannon, please? Go ahead, Janet.
Thanks, Kishore. So I'm just attempting to answer the question or some of the information on why an AGM. And basically the AGMs go back to originally, the SMA did come under the nonprofit legislation, which required an AGM. But a little bit of history, as of 1999, the SMA actually has its own legislation. We have the Saskatchewan Medical Association Act. So we can actually determine our own governance structures. So the AGM was kind of a hangover, and the only power the AGM actually has is, as we said, to make bylaw changes. Instead, the SMA has always preferred to use a democratic parliamentary process. That not being the only way to engage members, we want engagement with all of our members and transparency, and we do that through various different fronts. But the basic governance is the parliamentary system and not the AGM. So the good thing about the RA is everybody's voted in there. You need a quorum, which is 50% of delegates plus one to do the business of the association. The risk with the AGM is, as it stands currently, quorum is whoever shows up. So if there is a risk, if something came forward, that a very small number of people could power in something if it had more power, because there is no significant quorum. Even for bylaws, it's a percentage of quorum. The actual quorum is whoever shows up. So there is risk associated with the AGM the way it currently is, and the parliamentary system is most likely better, but that's up for debate, obviously.
That makes no sense.
Thanks, Dr. Shannon. Dr. Pillay, can we unmute Dr. Pillay, please? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dr. Viswanathan, for allowing me to speak again. That's a great question, Dr. Letting, and thank you, Dr. Shannon, for that segue into the discussion. I've had a chat with a few prominent past presidents about this elimination of the AGM. And it's interesting to note that not most, in fact, all of those past presidents actually stated to me that they didn't think this is a good idea. And I'm hoping that there's an opportunity for our past presidents to talk about why they feel that that's not an option to eliminate the AGM. Now, it may sound easy to eliminate it because there's low attendance. It's a quick meeting. It's a waste of time for an extra day. But we need to look at a few more additive points about the AGM. The AGM offers the general and ordinary members a forum to belong and be engaged. It is also a direct oversight to the RA and the board. And the RA and the board are answerable and accountable to the membership via the AGM. So if we eliminate that, we're actually eliminating an element of oversight. However, if we do elect to eliminate the AGM, we need to look at how we can reinforce the members' powers, the ordinary members' powers at the RA. Because if an ordinary member speaks at the RA, that's all he can do. An ordinary member cannot make a motion at the RA. An ordinary member cannot vote at the RA. All he can do is rant and rave. So if we are going to eliminate the AGM, we need to look at a way of changing the powers of the ordinary member at the RA. So, those are things that I would want to put out there for people to have a discussion when we're thinking about eliminating the AGM. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Pillay. Dr. Parvez, can we unmute Dr. Parvez, please? Go ahead.
Thank you, Kishore. My question is regarding the sections Dr. Shasteen mentioned, and especially I will be talking about my section, which is pediatrics. Last 25 years, pediatrics section has been dominated by Saskatoon, only Saskatoon and nothing else than Saskatoon. I tried my best to attend few of the meetings, section meeting of pediatrics, and I was the only person. So it seems like Saskatoon, of course, it always happens in Saskatoon. Whenever the RA is in Regina, somehow the section meeting never happens in Regina, or the members never show up. And all the selection, election, whatever you want to call it, happens in Saskatoon, and Saskatoon people takes over all the positions. I have spoken with Moose Jaw pediatricians, I've spoken with Yorkton pediatrician, I've spoken with Strip Current pediatrician. Somehow they are not represented at all. They never attend the meetings. It is never virtual, it's always in person. So my point is these sections and their elections are always dominated by Saskatoon, and no one else is ever elected or selected. Thank you.
Dr. Sharfstein, maybe you could hold your comment about Dr. Parvez's question. Dr. Strydom would like to make a comment. Dr. Strydom? Let's unmute Dr. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think I just want to make sure that, you know, the power of the organization really lies with the members and their engagement in MSAs, who the members, the executive of the MSAs are actually elected by the members on the ground. And so the same thing happens for the RA. So engagement really needs to be from ground level up to bring the issues and to have the trusted members being the leaders under those circumstances, bring us together so that we can collate and make sure that we have an idea of what's happening in all parts of the province, and then escalate those things upwards towards our parliament, which is really oversight for the whole system. So I think in terms of accountability, I think there is still lots of influence that I think is underutilized at this stage in terms of what needs to happen at MSA level, and our the need to engage more people to get engaged at that level to strengthen the rest of the system. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Strydom. Dr. Sharfstein, I'm going to pass back to you. You may want to specifically address Dr. Parvez's question about pediatric representation, Regina versus Saskatoon, but then perhaps we'll go on with the presentation. And before we do that, let me just say to everyone on the call, thank you for your patience and your stamina. We are actually in very good shape with our agenda, so hang in there. We're doing great. Brian, go ahead.
Thank you, Kishore. And Dr. Parvez raised one of a number of issues related to sections, and the special committee hasn't spent a lot of its effort. There's been a lot with the medical staff associations. A couple of points. So you need 10 or more members in a section to have an RA delegate. So a section with only one member wouldn't be electing an RA delegate. And there may be, there probably are questions about the election processes amongst many of the sections, and could democracy be introduced to the sections. I will bring you some comments that the committee has had specifically about the MSAs in that regard. And a chunk of business down the road might be to also try to do something to facilitate the same approach to the sections and their democratic processes as is being now taken with MSAs and with the RA. And the other comments will, of course, all be recorded, and the special committee, I'm sure they're all listening on this call, and we will be revisiting, I'm sure, several of these items on the basis of the input so far. And I would encourage you, as boring as it is, when you go home, have a look at this, drop a note or a comment, or even phone me. I'd be more than happy to hear from you saying, I also think you ought to know whatever. Would be very helpful. The next chunk. Oh, is there somebody has a hand up, I think. or maybe it disappeared. Okay.
I think we'll carry on.
Okay, so the next chunk was really as I say, the sense was what prompted the RA resolution in the first instance, which was to do whatever we could to enhance the process of nomination. So just again, to refresh your memory, what we're trying to do with what the committee is trying to do with its recommendations on this process: improve efficiency, be more effective, enhance transparency, fairness, accountability, and the opportunity for EDI. This is difficult, and in the interest of time and the fact that we're fairly late on an evening in June, I really don't want to go through this one step at a time, which it requires to fully understand it. So I'm going to go through it kind of in chunks, but really what you're seeing on the screen is the package you have. And I would encourage you to go through that. It should take you step by step through the process the committee is recommending to try and enhance those principles. First of all, there'd be a period of encouragement. So the idea, the hope is the RA would agree to a reconstituted committee as presented in those terms of reference. On the assumption that that may happen, even if it doesn't, whatever the nominating committee is, the suggestion is it should start with encouragement and promotion. That one of its mandates should be, it should be working around the year, trying to encourage and promote members to become involved, to seek elected positions, to seek opportunity to be appointed to committees, etc. So this would be an ongoing activity for the committee. In addition, though, when it's coming time for RA elections, the first step would be to determine what positions will require elections. So the committee will go through, and you'll see and hear a whole set of steps on how the committee will review the current membership, as well as, is anybody leaving because their term runs out? Is anybody leaving because they don't want to stay on the committee? They would ask incumbents, what is your plan? And so they would first determine where will there be vacancies. The next step would be then to contact those incumbents and to find out more about their intent, and to come up then with a summary of those positions where the incumbent is willing to stay, those positions where the incumbent is not, and create a comprehensive summary of what positions need to be elected by the RA. The next step we're calling passive recruitment. And really what this is canvassing the entire delegation to the RA. All delegates would be encouraged to consider seeking an elected position, looking for volunteers, part of that recruitment process. This would be in particular an expectation of the chair to contact the RA delegates, and in a very transparent way, so everybody knows we're doing this, and encourage them to put forward themselves for any of the positions. It would then result in somebody interested self-nominating, and there would be a form. They would express an interest, and when they send it in, there would be expectation of a short CV and some information in a form. The idea here is a standardized form, so when you go to vote for these people, you will be given a package of information with a similar amount of information about all of the candidates, short bio, CV, where they've been, and a few questions answered in a questionnaire. Following that, the committee will now look at the slate, say, we've got these people who volunteered, we've got these spaces, we've got these. They will then be able to determine if they have a candidate for every position. And here's where they'll apply this so-called attribute matrix, because the committee is not only being asked to fill every spot, they're being told it isn't any warm body will do. We are looking for the best possible leadership, and the RA is saying to the nominating committee, we want your help. We want you to help us find the best possible leaders. And we would like nothing better than there's 6 people wanting a position, and we can try and find the best candidate. So there'll be an attribute matrix, which will include consideration of the constituency they represent, as well as the skills that the individuals might have. The analogy I'd like to use here would be a football team. If your job is to fulfill the roster of a football team, you need to consider all the positions, and you might have 12 incredibly skilled quarterbacks, but we only need one. We also need linemen, and we need receivers, and we need defensive players. And similarly, when you're looking to suggest a slate of candidates for the board, you need to consider, we don't want 12 female urologists from Regina. That wouldn't make a very representative board. So where they come from and a whole spectrum of attributes there are important to get a mix. And similarly, do they have the skills? And in that draft matrix, there is some suggested that the committee will consider in more detail, suggested skills that would be important to consider. After the passive process, it's assumed there's going to be gaps. If passed as prologue, we have difficulty filling positions. There are not a lot of physicians coming forward, volunteering or nominating themselves for positions. So now there needs to be a period of active recruitment. The sense I have, and I think the committee shares that, is this process is the one that most potentially could be of some concern in terms of, in quotation marks, maintaining the old boys club, shoulder tapping only your friends, or whatever. So the idea here is it should be very open, but it should be acknowledged that there is a need to shoulder tap because we don't have enough qualified candidates and interested volunteers to fill all these positions. So the committee will try to identify potential candidates and encourage them to come forward and put their name forward. But if they do, they would go through that same attribute matrix in terms of process, and they would also provide that same information. So it would be hopefully very open and transparent. Finally, the committee would be asked to actually put a recommended slate. They're not being asked to tell us everyone who's willing to serve. They're saying apply your expertise and bring forward for the RA a slate, as they do now, of a recommended candidate for each position and a recommended number for the positions on the board. Following that, at the RA, the election procedure, again, nominations would be allowed from the floor. You would first be made aware in advance of those who have been, are being put forward, of who the incumbents are, what the current position is, and then any candidate being put forward at the RA would be expected to provide as well a short bio and be able to make sure that the members, when they vote later towards the end of the RA, would have that information. So there would be a matter of working out the logistics to make sure that you would be able to do that. And then there would be the vote at the RA. That's the process in a real whirlwind snapshot tour. And again, I would stop there and ask anyone on the committee if they would like to either expand or have other observations about that proposed process, or any questions or comments.
Thanks, Dr. Sharfstein. Dr. Thorpe has his hand up. Can we unmute Dr. Thorpe, please? Go ahead, please.
Hi there. Thanks, Brian. I just have it's a simple, silly little question, but I think it has a huge impact. I would like to see the name of the committee change from nominating to selection committee. And the reason why I say that is because the general membership sometimes thinks that the SMA is all about self-appointment, and that we are this sort of elite population of physicians who run the SMA, and we make all our own selections and we decide on our own committees and all that sort of thing. I think as part of the process, everything you outlined sounds really excellent. But at the same time, we are selecting someone. And yes, we may be nominating at the RA so that a decision is made. But I think just in terms of semantics, the wording selection committee has a little bit more of a palatable taste to it, to the general membership, to get away from that term of nominating committee. I think it also opens up the, it might open up interest in not self-appointment, but people putting in requests and saying, hey, I'd like to stand for that committee or that position. And then by choosing the name selection, I think that'll make a difference. Just an opinion.
Thank you. Dr. Sharfstein, it's back to you, please.
Okay, so if there are no other questions or comments currently, what I just went through is what you would have gotten as a presentation at the RA in May. I do want to go through a few other slides based on the discussion earlier by the membership committee, and see if you are in agreement. First is unfinished business. So there's some things that were already in the mandate of the special committee you had set up a year ago. The attribute matrix would be one of them that they would like to work on further. And they have observed that the current process by which we elect the nominating committee itself isn't really kosher, because the nominating committee puts forward nominations for itself. And they have suggested we ought to look at something alternative to that. And they have thrown some ideas around, but that's not fully baked. So those are two things that are unfinished. They would continue to work on over the next few months, if you agree. They also have a few things, and we go a couple more, Moni, I think, that I will call new business. So we are asking the RA if you would consider expanding the mandate of this committee, if you have enough faith in them to do this. First, they have observed, and I think in the comments that we've had tonight, we've heard similar. Thank you very much for helping us with our RA election processes. But there's another whole set of very important election processes that maybe could use help, the medical staff associations. Now that is already a work in progress. Ivan and others have worked with the MSA presidents, and there is a movement already to centralize the election processes, and I'll put in quotation marks, democratize them, very much along the lines of the processes we've just outlined for the RA. But the committee is willing to make further recommendations to help the MSAs with that. So if you thought that was a reasonable expansion, they are willing to make recommendations to also enhance those principles at the MSA election process, which I think, as Dr. Stryden points out, may be even more important. Secondly, there are all those bylaw amendments from the spring AGM, and the special meeting of the members says they're quite okay if the special committee takes those on, but this special committee's mandate is determined by the RA. You would need to approve that, and we're asking you to consider that. Thirdly, the current and future state of the Legend Policy Committee is an important question. And again, the committee, by virtue of taking on the board mandated, board proposed amendments, one of them was the Legend Policy Committee. The suggestion here is, first of all, some or all of the members of the committee might serve on a future Legend Policy Committee, but that the committee also be asked, the special committee, to make recommendations regarding the future mandate in terms of reference of the Legend Policy Committee. Those would be the potential new expanded mandate. So next steps, as was discussed earlier, and I won't talk about it currently here, the need for a comprehensive member engagement strategy over the next year. Special committee would continue to work, report in the fall on its progress and recommendations, and then finally come to the AGM as well as the spring RA with a final report and recommendations for bylaw change. And of course, only to be determined in May of 2023, the whole question of how do we implement the recommendations that the RA and AGM adopt. So again, a few comments here in member engagement, some thoughts, others have been already made tonight. Special meetings, I would suggest as an example, Those of you more comfortable with the RA amendments, the special committee members themselves, as well as the RA delegates, may want to have local meetings. And with, I would say with modern telecommunications and virtual options, some of us could join those meetings as resource as well, and would be pleased to do that to help engage the members. And I think I heard earlier support for some additional small group meetings, but lots of options and a need for an engagement plan. And you've seen earlier the proposed work plan. This is the same one again, on the assumption you approve that. So finally, then we come to the final opportunity for any questions or any comments. I'm showing you this now just so you will know the final piece of business would be for you to consider these potential resolutions. One, you would extend the term of the special committee for a year. Two, you would expand the mandate to include all of those things we talked about. And you would give the board the authority or recommend they appoint an interim legend policy committee. So those would be coming, but I'd stop now and leave it with you, Kishore, to determine if you would like to encourage some questions and answers first. And I would point out, Bonnie's just noted to me, it's been noted we don't have a quorum at this time. You can still, and I would suggest should pass resolutions, those would go to the board, and the board has the authority then to act on them absent a quorum.
Thanks, Brian. Before voting or taking, before voting, let's take any questions from the attendees. Does anyone have any comments or questions for Dr. Sharfstein?
Or the committee members.
Right. Dr. Harris, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. I just had a quick question about the committee or the special committee members. If you could list that again. I know you said it at the start, but and then a follow up is that committee set and there's no chance for extras, or I'm curious if there'd be other members that could join the committee as it's expanding its work, or if it'll be the same as what has already been in place.
I can I'll just read them to you. And so the current committee, Dr. Hammond was on the previous committee and is off. Dr. Nabuka, Dr. Opondo, Dr. Pillay, Dr. Prasad, and Dr. Stoneham. Those are the 5 current members that were elected. And the original mandate, they were to be elected by the RA. If you want to change the membership or add to it, you would need to have a resolution to do that, because this is currently a resolution of the RA that they're acting under.
Great, thank you. Dr. Sinha?
Hi, I'm sorry. I was just going to also point out that there are opportunities on the interim legislative and policy committee that are going to be coming up as well, and that everyone is going to be invited to express interest for if they are interested in that committee, which the people on the special committee will be invited, I think, most likely for the legislative and policy committee, but there will be other opportunities coming up as well. There's also a lot of vacancies still on a lot of different committees of the SMA, and reminding everyone that there's great opportunities there.
Thank you. Dr. Leding?
Yes, I've heard a lot of discussion tonight about having good balanced representation when we make important decisions. Brian gave us the names. I respect every person on that committee as being very useful, but I really want to make the point that I don't see a lot of rural representation on there. And my experience in collaboration is if you don't get the opinion to the table, sometimes your discussion's not too comprehensive because you just see what happens in the world you live in. I think the committee's a little out of balance for what we are trying to preach tonight, which is balance everywhere. And so therefore, there would be good reason if we're going to expand the mandate of this committee, that you expand, make sure that you have a good balance on that committee. And I don't think you do. I think you've got good members, but I don't think you have good balance.
Thanks, Dr. Leding. In order to give preference to first speakers, let's go next to Dr. Garcia, please.
Hello, Dr. Garcia, Urology and Swift Current. I think a little bit further to a couple of the points that have been mentioned, I think the representation from the rural areas really needs to be at least addressed, even if they're not necessarily included as members. Sure, it's easy to say, well, there's vacancies, but just taking that into context, if you're trying to participate in some of these committees, particularly when you're rural, if you're thinking of some of the specialists and people who are in the cities, and how much call, for example, that they do, I'd be surprised if many more of them are doing more than 60 or maybe even 80 days of call a year. Myself, I do over 200 days of call. So it's very difficult to add that on to additional administrative commitments to try to be that rural voice. At the same time, it's a little bit easier when you have 8, 10 or more colleagues who can share those clinical responsibilities with you. So it's a difficult thing to try and get the rural part in, but I think the onus has to be on those members who are part of those committees and in the city to reach out and get those experiences and get those contexts from those in the rural, because it's very difficult to parcel out that time. Just as an example, when we're even looking at the Representative Assembly member numbers, when we had that chart up showing again 15 and 15 members from each city, looking briefly at the list of the other sections, at least 10 of those sections, there's no way anybody outside of the city could be those section members. At a minimum, that puts 40 of the members from the cities, which is over 50% of the voting members of the RA, which is, again, a large representation. If we have all of the section representatives being from the city, which I think is the current situation, now you have about 75% or so of all of the voting members of the RA coming from the city. And I think you can quickly see how many of the rural communities are feeling like their voices are being lost, which regrettably translates into some of those MSAs being poorly attended, because if their voices are being lost, what's the point? So I think that it kind of has a bit of a trickle down effect. And I think that's where, particularly with these committees, even with the vacancies, that there really needs to be an emphasis on those committees reaching out to the rural members and the rural representatives as well, to really get their perspectives on what's happening, what's not happening, as opposed to just running as is, because it seems like there may be some overrepresentation of urban interests when making some of these recommendations and the rural interests are being, I don't want to say ignored, underrepresented in some of these discussions.
Great, thanks, Dr. Garcia. First time speakers on this round, Dr. Pillay.
Thank you, Dr. Viswanathan. Thank you, Dr. Leding and Dr. Garcia, for your comments. I think we need to look at this differently. I do believe that my personal representation on the governance committee represents all of our members in the RA and not just urban physicians. I believe that I represent the interests of all our physicians, both rural and urban. And I think I notice that sense when I sit in the discussions. So I don't think you should feel that the rural physicians are not represented at this discussion or at any of the committees. And I'm hoping my fellow colleagues also express the similar attitude when they're in the committees, that they express the interests of all physicians and not just an urban interest. So I think what we need to do is do a push-pull thing here. As much as we need to have that balance in committees that you ask for, and you ask for the committees to reach out to the rural physicians, I think we should look at it the other way as well. Let's have our rural physicians reach out to the members in those committees, to the SMA, to wherever you think you're not represented, and look at how we can improve the system. And I think there's mechanisms in place for that. And I don't think that the rural physicians should be considered left out of any discussion process, any voting process. I think there's a lot of balance in the system. So I would extend my personal hand to any member in the rural community who feels that they're not represented with their discussion, especially at governance level, I'm happy to provide my email and I'll help you. So, you know, it's a push-pull thing. And I think that do not feel that we do not think about the rural physicians in any of these committees. Thank you.
Dr. Harris, thank you for your patience. Can we unmute Dr. Harris, please?
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, it was just a quick follow-up to my initial question. And along with rural physicians not being on the committee, there aren't any females either. And I would just encourage there be more diversity in this group that's making such important decisions for us. So it's really just a comment, I guess, and understanding it needs to be an RA decision if there is going to be changes to the committee.
Thanks, Dr. Harris, and thank you for being so succinct. Dr. Letting? We'll just unmute you in a moment, Dr. Letting. There you go.
Thank you. Well, if there's one thing I've learned over the years of administration and medicine, it's that there's a lot of unique situations that need to be represented. Now, Dr. Pillay, if you don't live rural, you do not have the same insights, despite the best of intentions. I've thought many times I knew what was going on, but I'd never been exposed to that particular aspect of medicine, or perhaps also, as Dr. Harris says, the particular problems that a female physician may have versus a rural physician. I don't think you can try to represent us, but you can't represent what you've never experienced. So I don't agree that you can do my job, and I don't agree that I can send you my concerns about what you discussed at a meeting that I wasn't at. You need to have balance in that process, and I repeat, I do not think you have it right now. And that concerns me a great deal.
Thanks, Dr. Letting. Before we go on to the other people who have their hands up, I apologize. I did not, at the beginning of this session, indicate that we should have any time limits. You've probably seen that we are running a 2-minute clock. That has been the practice at SMA meetings. And because we're getting close to the end of the scheduled time, I'm going to ask any upcoming speakers, especially those who have spoken out previously and really contributed to this meeting, to really try to be succinct. Try to, once your comment is made, let's say your comment is made, and let's move on to the next speaker. So I am going to start looking at the 2-minute clock. Dr. Parvez, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you again. I respect all the comments made already, especially our senior Dr. Letting. To the point with the rural representation, I think COVID has taught us a lot. And today we are having an excellent example that all over Saskatchewan, we are sitting and having a 2-hour, 3-hour meeting with full hour expression going on. So for committees, rural representation, I think this virtual is very important. So ongoing, even if we get rid of COVID, we should continue this virtual meetings and have our rural physicians coming up and express their concern in all our RAs, all our section meetings, and all future meetings, so that far Saskatchewan side members should not be traveling and have their expression heard very nicely in all the RA meetings and section meetings. That's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Parvez. Dr. Garcia.
Thanks again. I think a little further, just to echo Dr. Letting's point, that we can have this discussion around the urban versus rural, but I just kind of was making the comment that there's a lot of challenges that don't exist in the city that limit rural physicians from being on these committees. And I was informing that, and that having that turned around, that it is now our onus to do that, to find that time, it's a little bit disconcerting. And I think, what I'm kind of trying to impart is that because of those limitations, there is a bit more of an onus on these committees who have predominantly urban membership to really try to reach out to the rural communities to really get a sense of what some of our challenges are, because we just can't carve out that time from our clinical responsibilities to be representatives ourselves often on these committees.
Thank you. As was mentioned, we do not have quorum, so any decisions or any vote taken does not have any binding effect. However, a poll that we take, vote or poll, however you want to characterize it, certainly gives the board information and a feel for the desires of the membership. And so we do have some questions for the group, and I think that is our next item. So we are going to take a poll. Once again, this is non-binding because we don't have quorum, but we're at least going to get a feel for the will of the attendees tonight. So the first question, be it resolved that the term of the Special Committee on SMA Governance be extended until May 2023. So let's put the poll up to vote on this resolution. Please vote on this resolution. I'm not seeing any changes in the votes right now, so we can close that poll. And this information, of course, we will send to the board. Can I see the next resolution?
Sorry, it's coming.
Resolution number 2. Be it resolved that the mandate of the Special Committee on SMA Governance be expanded to include consideration of board-proposed bylaw amendments and MSA election processes. So let's put that to a poll. Can we start the poll, please? Thank you. And again, a strong acceptance of that resolution, and we can pass that along to the board as an indication of the will of the RA who are in attendance today. Next resolution, please. Be it resolved that the RA recommends to the board that members of the Special Committee on SMA Governance be appointed to serve as members of an interim legislation and policy committee until May 2023. Can we put up a poll for this question, please? Thank you. We'll send that information to the board. Can I see the next slide, please? Thank you. Can I see, can we put everyone's pictures up again? Dr. Sharfstein, I will leave it to you before we close. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
only to thank those of you who've hung in there and stayed to provide your insights and comments. I think they've all been very informative. I would strongly encourage you to continue to do that. I noted on the elections, and we didn't have time to debate each of those where you might have been able to speak to it, but there are several of you who weren't comfortable with those suggested resolutions. And I would be very interested in the reasons for that, because many of them, for example, that question of the committee itself isn't representative and could you do something, et cetera. There may be ways we can do that, and the committee would want to, and the board, because at the end of the day, the hope is the membership is as close to 100% comfortable with where we're going, and that they're convinced that this will make the association more effective and more efficient, along with enhancing those principles. So anything we can address the angst you might have about any of the proposals is important. You have the committee member names in your packages, and I'm sure that any of them would be very amenable to interacting with you individually or collectively. I as well would be very open to hearing from you, to chatting with you in a group setting, or doing anything we can to facilitate that exchange over the next several months. So thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to further interaction going forward, unless were there any other comments?
Brian, thank you. Dr. Letting has a closing comment. Dr. Letting?
Thank you. I voted against every one of those motions because I object to the fact, this is the worst, I've never seen an RA where we couldn't have a discussion before we voted. I've never had a motion that was presented where discussion didn't help. And I think this was railroaded. I really am upset with it. I don't like at all what happened here. In principle, Brian, I support everything you suggested, but when I recognized that we were being, the comments that I brought up at representation were minimized and we had to vote despite that, I'm going to tell
Dr.
you right
Letting,
now.
Dr. Letting, I just want to point out, Dr. Letting, I want to point out that we did not have a quorum. These were not motions that carry any weight. Therefore, we did not follow the usual parliamentary procedure on this because they do not carry any weight. This was a straw poll. Dr. Letting, this was a straw poll so that we could give a bit of a flavor to the board in regards to what the will of the membership was. Dr. Jeffrey, you have your hand up. You're the president of the SMA. We'll give you a final comment.
Thank you, Kishore. I guess what I'd like to say is this is the very beginning of a very extended process that we want to reach out to everybody and hear voices, whether it is Dr. Letting in Rosetown, whether it is Dr. Blay in Regina, and whether it is going to be my friend Francisco Garcia down in Swiftburn. We want to listen to everybody's voice. Tonight was just the start. And as was mentioned here by Kishore earlier, we did have quorum. These are not binding resolutions. It's a poll. It's a way to get the flavor of the room, so to speak, so that we can have some understanding from you, but also at least have some vague understanding from us where this whole process is going. It's going to take us the entire year, and it's going to require extended outreach from us to you, and it's bi-directional from you, and find out what everybody's concerns are. We do want to make this a
John, sorry, John, I want to check in with everybody. I'm having great difficulty hearing you, John.
Dr. Kishore say the last weeks.
Thank you very much. And with that, let me please say thank you to everyone for joining in tonight. I feel this is above and beyond the call of duty for all of you. And of course, you're doing it on behalf of your colleagues, your friends, your fellow physicians. working on these issues, communicating the issues back to them, taking this information back, and then bringing their thoughts back to the RA. So thank you to everyone. Special thanks to the staff at the SMA who always make this a joy to come and work on. And particular thanks to Brian Sharfstein. Brian, thank you very much for all the work you've done and all the heavy lifting you did tonight. Thank you to everyone for joining in, and we look forward to many more conversations. This is a start. Thank you all. Good night.